From immigration to contraception, a new breed of right-wing Republicans is determined to control America's future, but only to make the future look a lot more like the past. Y'all, Trump was just the beginning.
Nobody has any idea where these people are coming from, and we know they come from prisons, we know they come from mental institutions, insane asylums, we know they're terrorists. It's poisoning the blood of our country.
Having a kid is a vote for the future. If you intend to have a child like that, that means you care about the future.
I called him to say, Donald, the fund is running low. And without skipping a beat, he said, your son doesn't recognize you. Let him die.
A loud and obnoxious minority of Americans think they should get to decide who deserves to be here on the planet and in this country. Their bedazzled jean jackets and Trump is my savior t-shirts may be new, but their rhetoric carries clear echoes of the past. Today, we're talking about eugenics, the pseudo-scientific campaign to breed better humans that captivated Americans and inspired Germans at the turn of the 20th century, then seemingly disappeared after World War II. But turns out it didn't really disappear. It just went underground. Long after racial hygiene stopped being considered polite dinner conversation, the logic of eugenics continues to permeate public policy. And as the new right's panic over the so-called Great Replacement intensifies, its adherents are becoming ever more comfortable saying the quiet part out loud, that only certain people make America great. I dug in to find out how the formal eugenics movement blossomed, shriveled, then reconstituted itself across the decades in public hearts, minds, and policies, and what we can do to stop a full resurgence. This is how eugenics shaped America. Roll the intro.
They're almost all white, they're almost all Protestant, middle to upper middle class, and they tended to equate human worth with the qualities that they themselves possessed.
Thank you to Factor for partnering with me on today's video. Y'all, the news has been happening fast, okay? I barely have time to get all my work done, let alone cook myself delicious gourmet meals. Luckily, with Factor, that's not a problem. They send fresh, never frozen meals straight to my door, and I can heat them up in 3 minutes. No cutting, chopping, or cleaning at all. Factor truly is a lifesaver. And with over 35 meals to choose from every week, like I just tried their roasted garlic chicken for the first time, and please ignore how badly I plated it, okay, because it was really delicious. I don't know how they get their veggies tender crisp every single time. And Factor has a variety of options to suit your needs like vegetarian, keto, and more. Factor could be a lifesaver for you too. Get your grubby little hands on chef-prepared Factor meals and get more time back to do the things that matter to you. Go to factor75.com or click the link below and use code Leeja50 to get 50% off your first Factor box and 20% off your next month of orders. That's code Leeja50 at factor75.com to get 50% off your first box plus 20% off your next month of orders. Thanks, Factor. The term eugenics was coined in 1883 by Sir Francis Galton, a contemporary and cousin of Charles Darwin. Galton argued that mental and physical traits are equally heritable. Therefore, it should be possible to selectively breed better humans. The word eugenics comes from Greek words meaning well-born. Eugenics enthusiasts tended to believe that they were the best and the brightest society had to offer and that they were therefore qualified to breed a better race. As historian Daniel J. 𝗪𝗠𝗧 put it,
they're almost all white, they're almost all Protestant, middle to upper middle class, and they tended to equate human worth with the qualities that they themselves possessed.
From the start, eugenics was a tool of social control masquerading as a science, and its elitist logic quickly took hold in America. At the turn of the 20th century, the US was changing at unprecedented speeds. Industrialization, urbanization, and immigration, largely from Eastern and Southern Europe, made the elites who consider themselves Native Americans, because their ancestors came over from different parts of Europe slightly less recently, fear that their way of life was at risk. Two parallel arms of eugenics sprung up simultaneously to combat the threat of dirty foreigners and dum-dums polluting the gene pool and destroying society: positive and negative eugenics. In so-called positive eugenics, the focus was on getting people with superior genes to breed with one another. At the peak of its influence, people were taking their responsibility to procreate strong white American babies very seriously. A guy might get turned down for a date for wearing glasses because his eyeballs were seen as a genetic liability. To further enshrine eugenics eugenic thinking into American minds, a propagandist organization called the American Eugenics Society turned it into a game. The first Fitter Families for Future Firesides contest was held at the Iowa State Fair in 1911. At their peak, these contests were held in 40 different states. The competitions drew participants from miles around for a primer on eugenics disguised as wholesome entertainment. Each contestant would submit to a rigorous 3-hour inspection that included a physical exam and a detailed family history. Points were awarded for things like straight, healthy teeth, musical talent, or a family history of longevity, while points were deducted for every epileptic uncle, hysterical sister, and untimely demise in a lineage. And the idea of breeding better humans wasn't just popular in the US. In 1935, Germany took the fitter family concept to the extreme with its Lebensborn program, in which doctors and so-called race examiners matched the best of the best Aryan stock and sent them to special camps to conceive and care for large families in a utopian environment, like beautiful cows with perfect straight teeth. Then there was negative eugenics, meaning efforts to restrict anyone considered undesirable from reproducing. The Germans took a lot of inspiration from Americans on this too. The 1935 Nuremberg race laws denying citizenship to Jews and criminalizing intermarriage was modeled in part on US laws banning interracial marriage, black suffrage, and immigration of undesirables. Yikes. In this video, we're going to focus on 2 key policy areas where eugenic logic and rhetoric have really grabbed hold and thrived: immigration and reproduction. The remnants of eugenics can still be seen in far-right immigration and reproduction ideology today, but I'm getting ahead of myself. In 1907, the state of Indiana became the first government body in the modern world to enact an involuntary sterilization law. Under the so-called Indiana program, the state could sterilize any person deemed unfit to reproduce, specifically confirmed criminals, idiots, imbeciles, and rapists. That initial law specifically focused on men, forcing vasectomies on poor white men who had been identified as sexually deviant, because throughout time it turns out that poor people have always been seen as sexually inappropriate or promiscuous and outside the bounds of what middle and high society deemed appropriate. But by the 1930s, women became the primary targets of state-sanctioned sterilization, as conversations shifted from which genes should be allowed to proliferate to who was capable of being a good parent. As men are not and never have been seen as the primary caregiver for children, it fell out of fashion to control their reproduction and instead fell on women to be deemed worthy of motherhood. Regardless of the angle, at the beginning of the 20th century, the person's fitness would almost always be determined by an incredibly biased intelligence test. In the US, categories of incompetence were codified by a psychologist named Henry Goddard. In 1908, Goddard identified 3 categories of incompetence: idiot, meaning someone with a mental age of 2 years or younger; imbecile, meaning someone with a mental age of 3 to 7 years; and morons, people with mental ages from 8 to 12, from the Greek moronia, meaning foolish. Goddard asserted that morons were incapable of maturing past early adolescence, making them extremely dangerous to society and therefore prime candidates for sterilization. In 1917, Goddard was brought in to help develop mental intelligence tests for US Army recruits for World War I. Of the almost 2 million recruits tested, nearly half were characterized as feeble-minded, having a mental age below 13 years. Goddard had found similar results a few years earlier when testing immigrants at Ellis Island. A whopping 40% of all the Jews, Italians, and Hungarians tested qualified as morons. Instead of pausing to consider that maybe something was wrong with his little test, Goddard doubled down, writing, "We know that it is never wise to discard a scientific result because of apparent absurdity." The following year, deportations for so-called feeble-mindedness doubled, and in 1917, Congress enacted one of its first broadly restrictive immigration laws. It required immigrants over 16 to pass a literacy test, increased taxes on arriving immigrants, and allowed immigration officials to exercise more discretion when deciding who to reject. By 1919, intelligence testing had become a national craze. An adapted version of the Army test called the National Intelligence Test sold 500,000 copies in a single year. Businesses, schools, and law enforcement all used the test to filter out undesirables, an example of how unsound science, backed by a single maniac with a PhD, can wind its way into our culture and become common knowledge despite being based on absolutely nothing. See, for example, the BMI. This national intelligence test included questions like, the Knight engine is used in the Ford, the Pierce Arrow, or the Lozier car, as though a question about car engines is an accurate way to test intelligence as opposed to just general trivia knowledge. How well a person performed depended entirely on their level of education and how attuned they were with middle-class culture. The data collected from Goddard's tests was garbage, but would nonetheless prove extremely useful in furthering the eugenic cause. And nobody used flawed data better than this guy, Harry Laughlin, the eugenics movement's most persuasive lobbyist and the assistant director of the Eugenics Records Office, the national hub of eugenic research and outreach. Between 1920 and 1924, Harry Laughlin testified before Congress 3 times, using flawed, misleading data to great effect.
He had numbers that purported to show that rates of insanity were different among immigrants from different countries, that certain nationalities were much more likely to have their immigrants become prison inmates. And he also argued that just biologically, because we were largely a Nordic, Northern European country, it was harder to assimilate immigrants from other parts of the world.
Did you know that the concept of race is completely made up? We owe the concept of a Nordic race to this piece of shit, Madison Grant. He was a fancy lawyer from a fancy American family who at one point was best known for his work conserving the redwood trees. Today, he's best known for single-handedly transforming eugenics from a survival of the fittest thing into a racial purity thing. Madison was disgusted and offended by the unwashed masses crowding the streets outside his New York City law offices, and he decided to channel all his bigoted energy into writing a book, in which he invented the tall, blonde-haired, blue-eyed Nordic race and argued that as supposedly the most recently evolved of all the races, Nordic genes were fragile and therefore had to be protected from more primitive races, lest their genes overwhelm the superior but not yet stable genes of the Nordics. Hitler read Grant's book, The Passing of the Great Race, while he was in jail, and once he got out, wrote a fan letter to Madison Grant, calling the book his Bible. The Passing of the Great Race was also quoted numerous times in the congressional record during discussions of immigration policy. In the first decade or so after the Indiana sterilization program had kicked off, states struggled to write sterilization laws that could survive judicial challenges in state appellate courts. So, in 1922, our good friend Harry Laughlin published his opus, Eugenical Sterilization in the United States. Both a history book and an instruction manual, the text compiled every sterilization law ever passed and every case ever brought, then laid out Laughlin's own model eugenical sterilization law, designed to withstand due process challenges. It would be put to the test in 1927. The woman selected as Virginia's involuntary sterilization guinea pig was a teen mom by the name of Carrie Buck. Buck was sent to a colony for epileptics and feeble-minded after giving birth at the age of 14. She'd been assaulted by her foster family's nephew, but rather than deal with any of that, they just labeled her an imbecile and dropped her off at the same facility that was holding her birth mother. Carrie's biological mom had been at that colony since 1920 when she was diagnosed as feeble-minded, a diagnosis based less on medical evidence than on the doctor's impression of her sexual behavior. The best way to deal with tarts, floozies, and harlots? Lock them up. It's for their own good. Despite the lack of solid scientific footing, Carrie Buck and her mother's diagnoses were treated as factual when brought before the Supreme Court in 1927. Chief Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr. rendered the verdict in favor of sterilizing Carrie Buck, writing, "It is better for all the world if instead of waiting to execute degenerate offspring for crime or to let them starve for their imbecility, society can prevent those who are manifestly unfit from continuing their kind. 3 generations of imbeciles are enough." Though subsequent testing would find that both Carrie and the daughter she birthed at 14 were of average intelligence, it was too late. Carrie Buck was the first person of thousands who would be involuntarily sterilized under Virginia's eugenics laws. Laughlin's model law was a success, and his example not only went on to help shape the Nazi Party's 1934 racial hygiene law, but also informed 27 additional state sterilization laws in the U.S. alone. In the 2 decades leading up to Buck v. Bell, about 6,000 sterilizations had been performed in the U.S. In the 6 years following the decision, that number would more than double. By the close of the 1930s, more than 30,000 Americans had been involuntarily sterilized nationwide.
If you look back at all the sterilization laws passed, the easiest way to sum up who their targets were is round up the usual suspects. You are generally going to be dealing with poor people, people who are part of a disfavored minority, people who were on private charity or public welfare, people who had disabilities, mental or physical, and people who were generally considered somehow on the margins of society.
But those margins would shift after the stock market crashed in 1929. Life savings evaporated. A quarter of the country was left unemployed. And suddenly, with Harvard graduates standing on the breadline, poverty stopped seeming like a good marker of a person's inherent value. Devastating economic circumstances shifted the conversation away from the idea that poverty is biological and towards a more moralistic critique focused on a person's fitness to parent, not just to reproduce. Then World War II happened, and as the horrors of the concentration camps and involuntary experimentation came to light, and the world reflected on how Nazi ideas of racial superiority took root, we vowed never again, and eugenics became a dirty word. That, however, only meant that outward racism in favor of creating a pure race was no longer acceptable, but eugenics continued quietly marching forward under new, more socially acceptable names. After World War II, this happened in the form of rewriting the script on sterilization of unfit mothers. Physicians and others argued that, actually, the sterilization of women who were intellectually incapacitated would free them. They could live independently without fear of pregnancy and institutionalization. Sterilization is benevolent. And separately, there was a eugenics-based underpinning in the movement to provide women with legal access to contraception. Did you know that Planned Parenthood's founder, Margaret Sanger, was very much in bed with the eugenics movement? She aligned herself with ableist and white supremacist organizations in her mission to provide birth control for all. Her efforts often focused on controlling birth in Black communities, again, shrouded by the argument that she had good intentions and that birth control for Black women is actually helpful and good. Which, to be clear, it is if it's not underpinned by a desire to control who is and is not having children, which is no longer the mission of Planned Parenthood, I'll let you know. Throughout the 20th century, forced and coerced sterilizations were performed on women of color both in and outside of institutional custody, often by vigilante surgeons, always under the guise of the greater good. But the goal was the same as the eugenics movement: decrease the dependent population of undesirables. Let's explore some examples. Between the 1930s and the 1970s, 37% of Puerto Rican women of childbearing age were sterilized. Let me just repeat that. From 1930 to the 1970s, 37% of Puerto Rican women of childbearing age were sterilized. Many of them had been pressured into the procedure by doctors who presented it as the only means of contraception, never bothering to mention that the procedure is irreversible. In the 1940s, Dr. Clarence Gamble, as in Procter & Gamble, launched a sterilization campaign through his nonprofit Birthright in North Carolina. The campaign would continue well into the 1970s, decades after the state ended its formal sterilization programs. In 1948 alone, records show more than 150 sterilizations, mostly performed on young Black women who were neither institutionalized nor mentally deficient in any way. Sterilization procedures were also regularly snuck into other operations, particularly appendectomies. According to the New York Times, the practice of being sterilized, including during unrelated surgery, grew so common among poor Black women in the South that it came to be known as a Mississippi appendectomy. In 1961, prominent voting rights activist Fannie Lou Hamer was given a hysterectomy without her consent by a white surgeon who was removing a tumor from her uterus. The Indian Health Service was founded in 1955 to provide educational and medical resources to Indigenous Americans living on reservations. Yet the people sent to care for Native Americans didn't always provide that care. According to historian Jane Lawrence, some of the IHS doctors did not believe that American Indian and other minority women had the intelligence to use other methods of birth control effectively, and that there were already too many minority individuals causing problems in the nation. A rash of forced sterilizations began in the 1960s and continued through the 1970s, even after new regulations were passed. It's estimated that between 1970 and 1976, as many as 50% of Native American women were sterilized, devastating their communities both personally and politically. In addition to divorce and deep depression, Lawrence connects the tribe's loss of political power to their dwindling numbers, rooted in these forced procedures. In the early 1970s, obstetricians in California working in federally funded family planning programs sterilized immigrant Mexican women without their consent, often while they were getting C-sections. Despite eventually losing a class action lawsuit, the push against forced sterilization of Mexican women led to new laws in California requiring consent forms be provided in Spanish. Translating consent forms for medical procedures? groundbreaking. Far too often, doctors took it upon themselves to decide who was and was not fit for motherhood. Making life-altering, permanent decisions without consent became routine. Until in 1973, the Southern Poverty Law Center blew the lid off the whole conspiracy by filing a lawsuit against 𝗪𝗪𝗧𝗪𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗪𝗧𝗧, Secretary of the U.S. Department of Health, Education, and Welfare, on behalf of Mary Alice and Minnie Lee Ralph, two sisters who had been victimized by abusive sterilization practices in the South as young teens. Their mom, who was illiterate, had signed an X on what she thought was a permission form for birth control shots. Instead, her 12 and 14-year-old daughters were taken from their home in Montgomery, Alabama, and sterilized by a doctor working in a federally funded clinic. According to the New York Times, Weinberger v. Ralph helped reveal that more than 100,000, mostly Black, Latina, and Indigenous women were sterilized under U.S. government programs over decades. It also officially ended this practice and forced doctors to obtain informed consent before performing sterilization procedures. Though, as it would turn out, forced sterilizations by state governments would continue into the 21st century. Today, nearly every state's eugenic sterilization law has been repealed. As of 2022, 8 states had issued official apologies for their government-sanctioned sterilization programs. 3 of the worst offenders, Virginia, North Carolina, and California, have each started programs to compensate victims. And yet,
an offer to shave off 30 days of their sentence if they agree to get a vasectomy or other procedures that would prevent them from having children.
Pop singer Britney Spears claims she's been forced to wear an IUD against her will.
New report shows nearly 250 female inmates at California prisons were sterilized without state approval.
The women involved all gave consent for the procedure, but some say they felt pressured into getting it done.
Kelly Dillon was a 23-year-old inmate at the Central California Women's Facility when she told prison doctors they could perform a hysterectomy on her if and only if her biopsy showed cancer. Instead,
he intentionally cut off the blood supply to my ovaries and then began to perform what was a sterilization on me. And when the doctor came in and told me that he didn't find any cancer, didn't tell me anything else, I was relieved. But then several months after that, I began to experience menopausal symptoms at the age of 24. And when I began to question the prison to see, well, what happened to me, to get some answers as to what happened in surgery, they began to start giving me the runaround. We are withheld that information, and if we begin to press, we are reprimanded and also sometimes put in lockdown or different situations. We're punished to go after those medical records.
It took Kelly a full year to get a hold of her medical records, and that was with the help of a dedicated advocacy agency. As we discussed in a recent video, the GOP isn't satisfied by overturning Roe. They want all of our reproductive rights. Earlier this year, the Supreme Court threw out FDA v. Alliance for Hippocratic Medicine, in which a bunch of doctors who could prove no harm and therefore lacked standing argued that mifepristone, an extremely safe and widely used medication that can be used to terminate pregnancy, should be banned. In dismissing the case, the court left the door open for its key argument to be reused, that the Comstock Act of 1873 bans the transport of obscene materials, including anything related to abortion, via the mail. This once assumed dead law was designed by a man on a personal mission to maintain and protect procreation among white Protestant Americans in the face of rising immigration. As the New Republic put it, Comstock's desire to outlaw the trade and circulation of articles for contraception and abortion is one facet of the eugenic project, and one in which he was far from alone. Rather, it was part of a broader push to force women into compulsory reproduction. Not all women, though. The right kind of women. Brown women were out. And immigrant women? Absolutely not. Along with providing pseudoscience to back up incredibly harmful and bigoted sterilization and procreation policies, eugenics also offered a scientific-sounding rationale for the rising anti-immigrant sentiment in American society at the turn of the 20th century. Even the Irish, so recently despised themselves, jumped in to shit on these new immigrants and lobby for federal restrictions on how many people from the undesirable countries could come in. Meanwhile, labor organizations stoked fears that working-class Americans would lose their jobs to cheap immigrant labor. Sound familiar? And anti anti-communist factions warned of the impending red tide from Russia and Eastern Europe. All that pressure culminated on May 26, 1924, when President Coolidge signed the Johnson-Reed Act into law. It set devastatingly limited quotas on immigration to the United States among Southern and Eastern Europeans and Asians that would reduce immigration by 97%. This prevented the immigration of large swaths of European Jews who would later be massacred during World War II. After the war in 1952, Congress updated the Johnson-Reed Act with language that sounded friendlier, yet still resulted in 85% of available visas going to people from Northern and Western Europe. The real shakeup came in 1965, when a new Immigration Act was passed as an extension of the Civil Rights Movement. It eliminated the quotas and set a new flat cap of 20,000 entrants for every country. It also prioritized family reunification, employment, and refugee status. The following years saw a steady rise in immigration, but the predictable backlash was close on its heels. Escalating nativist and xenophobic sentiments brought a rise in nationalist, nativist, and anti-immigrant groups. Prominent among these groups was the Federation for American Immigration Reform, or FAIR, which was established in 1979 by a group of population control activists and environmentalists who feared that mass immigration was fueling unsustainable population growth and environmental degradation in the U.S. One of FAIR's biggest donors was the Pioneer Fund, an explicitly eugenic organization whose first president was our good friend Harry Laughlin, the mastermind behind the model eugenical sterilization law in the 1920s. After FAIR was founded in 1979, it lobbied the White House using the eugenics movement's oldest fave, bunk data, specifically polling data, to demonstrate public support for immigration restriction. And that polling data wound up influencing the actual policy decisions of none other than Ronald fucking Reagan. Reagan's administration was eager to slow legal immigration and stop illegal immigration altogether. To this end, in 1981, Ronnie created the President's Task Force on Immigration and Refugee Policy to propose recommendations to address unlawful immigration, particularly among laborers crossing the southern border in search of work. In November 1985, Reagan signed the Immigration Reform and Control Act into law. You've probably had to fill out an I-9 form or two when starting a new job. Yeah, you have the Immigration Reform and Control Act to thank for that. It requires employers to confirm the work eligibility of their employees. It helped prevent discrimination against lawful workers, but also increased border security and ballooned the budget for Border Patrol. The Border Patrol's budget continued creeping upward until 2003, when it exploded with the creation of the Department of Homeland Security. Between 2003 and 2021, ICE spending nearly tripled, from $3.3 billion to $8.3 billion. And if Trump wins in November, immigration control will likely take on an all-new final boss form. Chapter 5 of Project 2025's Mandate for Leadership recommends that DHS be closed and replaced with a new standalone border and immigration agency at the cabinet level. And whatever that might look like in practice, you can bet that eugenic logic would be all over a second Trump presidency. I mean, why wouldn't it be? It was all over the first one.
Why are we having all these people from shithole countries come here? He then suggested that the United States should instead bring more people from countries like Norway.
Donald J. Trump is calling for a total and complete shutdown of Muslims entering the United States.
Build that wall. Build that wall. Build that wall.
No, they have a word. It sort of became old-fashioned. It's called a nationalist. You know what I am? I'm a nationalist, okay? I'm a nationalist.
Jews will not replace us! Jews will not replace us!
And now, with JD childless cat ladies Vance and his creepy biohacking tech bro backers salivating at the chance for a seat at the right hand of President Donald Trump 2.0, check out my video on Peter Thiel because that guy's a fucking creep, plus the roadmap of Project 2025 lighting the way, the far right is poised to pounce on the opportunity to bring eugenics back to the mainstream. Despite the plausible deniability, their policies are filled with contradictions and lay bare their complete disgust with lives they deem unworthy and their desire for control over our procreation. Women are unworthy of making their own choices about their bodies and whether to procreate. They can't decide about abortions, and actually, you know, now that you ask, birth control is also bad and probably shouldn't be left up to women either. Once those kids are in the world though, the brown ones, unworthy of state assistance in any form. Immigrants are coming to kill us all and take our jobs and replace us with their bad brown babies, so we need to stop their flow as quickly as possible. It's eugenics without the name. Some are worthy of life, comfort, and safety. Others are less than human and women for their own good don't. If your idea of utopia depends on systematically excluding people you've decided don't deserve to be treated like people, then it's just fascism. Conservatives love hearing themselves talk about how much respect they have for human dignity and life. The catch is just that they don't actually see most other people as human. It's the same mentality that brought us such hits as slavery, the Holocaust, state-sponsored sterilizations, and mass deportation campaigns. And unless we want sequels, we need to get our shit together. There were a bunch of eugenics-coded examples that I skipped, from nefarious adoption and foster care practices to, for example, Ronald fucking Reagan's refusal to address the AIDS crisis because it was God's punishment for the gays. The list goes on. Kamala Harris has managed to inject a significant amount of fresh enthusiasm into this election, but just because projections are slightly improving doesn't mean that we're out of the woods. Let's not repeat 2016, y'all. Do not underestimate these people. And whether or not Trump wins in November, we'll still have to contend with the obnoxious extremist contingent that has shifted our national politics terrifyingly far to the right, bolstered by a Supreme Court chomping at the bit to do away with all our rights as swiftly as possible. This won't be over until every one of their state and local officials, judges, and school board members have all been replaced with people who actually believe that, you know, all men are created equal or whatever those old dead guys said. Shout out to my newest supporters on Patreon, as well as supporters in my royal tiers, and a very special shout out to my multi-platinum supporters, T, LaTranger Lucas, Joshua Cole, Thomas Johnson, Sophia Sams, Anthony Giles, Tay, and Brett Piantek. Your generosity makes this channel what it is, so thank you. If you enjoyed this video, you'll also like the one I made about how they're coming for contraception next. Thanks so much for watching. Have a good day. Bye-bye.
Yikes.